We've now seen our first two factors which influence exchange rates: imports and exports, and speculation. If investors speculate and predict that a currency will depreciate in the future, they'll sell or supply more of that currency now while the exchange rate is still high, and this will cause depreciation now. On the other hand, if investors speculate and predict that a currency will appreciate in the future, they'll buy or demand more of that currency now while the exchange rate is still low so they can sell it later for more, and this will cause appreciation now. Our third factor that influences exchange rates is relative interest rate. For instance, in 2010, the Reserve Bank of Australia increased their base interest rate to try and limit inflation. And when the base interest rate goes up, Australian high street banks also put their interest rates up. So when Australia increased their interest rate, hot money investors from abroad with tons of spare cash started putting their money into Australian banks to cash in on the higher interest rate. So hot money started flowing towards Australian banks. But to save in Australian banks, you need Australian dollars. So, as hot money investors started putting more money into Australian banks, they had to exchange their own currency and buy more Australian dollars, meaning that the demand for Australian dollars increased. And an increase in demand for a currency will appreciate the exchange rate. So, when Australia raised their interest rate, their exchange rate appreciated. So, if a country's interest rate is relatively high compared with the interest rates in other countries, the value of a currency will appreciate. On the other hand, if Australia's interest rates decreased, if Australia decreased their interest rate, hot money would flow out of Australia to a country with a higher interest rate. So, investors would have to sell their Australian dollars to buy a different currency from a country with a higher interest rate, so the supply of Australian dollars would increase. And this increased supply of Australian dollars would depreciate Australia's exchange rate. So, in summary, our third factor influencing exchange rates is relative interest rate. If a country has a high interest rate compared to the interest rates in other countries, hot money will flow into that country because investors want to cash in on the high interest rate. This will increase demand for the currency, appreciating the value of the currency. But if a country's interest rate is low relative to the interest rates in other countries, hot money will flow out of that country, increasing the supply of the currency and therefore depreciating the value of the currency.